Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. This video is about the maps of Middle-earth, and when you hear that, you might think, the maps? Really? I mean, sure, they're helpful as a reference, they're certainly very pretty, and they probably took a lot of time to make, but don't they speak for themselves? Isn't that kind of the point of a map? Believe me, I was thinking the same things, until I embarked on my own little quest through the ironically uncharted territory of critical fantasy cartography, and now I can never look at them the same way. In this video, I'll look at the creation and publication of the main maps of Middle-earth, describe how Tolkien used them both for world-building and as a literary device, and look at their impacts on Tolkien's readers and on fantasy fiction as a whole. Tolkien was far from the first person to make a fictional map of a literary setting. Famous earlier examples include Gulliver's Travels, The Divine Comedy, and Treasure Island. However, most scholars agree that the widespread use of the fantasy map in the 20th and 21st centuries is almost entirely due to the influence of The Lord of the Rings. Maps are so common in fantasy that they quickly became objects of satire, and yet there's no sign of them going out of fashion. And Tolkien's maps have become emblematic of The Lord of the Rings. No other single image evokes so many of the scenes and emotions developed in the novel. In fact, this familiarity actually makes exploring Tolkien's maps more challenging. But their importance to Middle-earth and to the fantasy genre makes it all the more necessary to try to disentangle all the meanings they contain. I readily admit that including a definition of the word map in a video about maps seems not only trite but painfully unnecessary. After all, everyone knows a map when they see one. But when you stop to think about it, that's actually somewhat surprising, since no two maps look exactly alike. Among the definitions of the word I encountered in my research, and trust me, there are a lot more out there than you would think, the one I like best comes courtesy of National Geographic, which states a map is a symbolic representation of selected characteristics of a place. That sounds accurate enough, but it's also a remarkably broad definition. We are most used to seeing maps of cities, countries, and continents, but you could make a map of anything from the human brain to an entire galaxy. Likewise, especially in the context of fantasy, we are most used to maps that provide a mix of basic geographic information. Things like landforms, borders, population centers, and travel routes. However, maps can show anything from annual rainfall to religion. In Here Be Dragons, a study of fantastic cartography, Stefan Ekman identifies a few more traits common to maps. He cites cartographer Dennis Wood's claim that all maps, real or fictional, necessarily have three things: an author, the person making the map, a subject, or what it's a map of, and a theme, which is what the author is telling us about the subject. Ekman also points out that all maps have to be selective, both in what information they show and how they represent it. Finally, maps can, and often do, include features like a title, labels, a key or legend, a scale, directional orientation, and sometimes information on how the curved area of the map was projected onto a flat piece of paper, though Ekman notes that if you're mapping, say, Terry Pratchett's Discworld, the question of projection never arises. During the earliest phases of Middle-earth's creation, Tolkien created sketches, maps, and diagrams of Beleriand, Valinor, and Arda itself. These were unpublished during his lifetime and were probably mainly intended for his own reference, or possibly his own satisfaction, during the composition of his First-Age legends. Some of these earliest graphic representations of Middle-earth are strikingly different from the familiar maps in the published works. A diagram titled I Vene Kemen presents the key features of the world in the form of a ship. The maps attached to the Ambar Kanta, a work from the 30s, recall ancient and medieval maps that portrayed the world as a circle surrounded by an ocean. As much conceptual maps as they are physical, they show the changing form of Arda across history, often including different layers filled with different elements. Sometime between the late 20s and early 30s, Tolkien created a map of Beleriand in a style very similar to the one he would use for the Lord of the Rings maps, reflecting the greater detail and realism he had begun to apply to the legends of Middle-earth. His second, expanded version of this map, completed even before the publication of The Hobbit, was also his final one, on which all the published Silmarillion maps were based. Even in the earliest scribbled pages of what would become Chapter 1 of The Hobbit, Tolkien already included a sketch of Thror's map. In 1936, when Tolkien submitted the typescript of the completed book to publishers, he also sent in several illustrations and 4 additional maps, though only Thror's map and a map of Wilderland would be redrawn and printed in the book as endpieces. Though distinct in style, they've become iconic in their own right. But the most famous of Tolkien's maps is the one included as a fold-out sheet printed in black and red in the first edition of The Fellowship of the Ring. Redrawn by Christopher Tolkien in 1953 from the working maps Tolkien had used while writing the book, this map depicts the west of Middle-earth in the Third Age. Tolkien described it as a general, small-scale map of the whole field of action. Although adjusted, corrected, and expanded versions of this map were issued over the following years, Christopher Tolkien later noted, as things turned out, it became, for all its defects and oddities, the map, and my father himself always used it as a basis afterward, while frequently noticing its inadequacies. The Jackson films of the early aughts made extensive use of their own version of this map, which became a prominent motif in marketing and merchandise. But this general map is only one of 3 included in The Lord of the Rings. The Fellowship of the Ring also includes a smaller map titled Part of the Shire just before Chapter 1, and a close-up map of Gondor, Rohan, and Mordor appeared in the 1956 publication of The Return of the King. Tolkien had identified all 3 of these as necessary additions to the text early on, but their intricacy, size, and use of color made them costly additions, and Tolkien struggled to provide versions of them suitable for publication. In one letter, Tolkien described some of the challenges of working on the close-up map published in The Return of the King. There is a wide gap between a working map, rough if accurate in scales and distances, useful to the narrator to whom a dot is often enough without a name, and one drawn and lettered passably enough for reproduction. I've had to call in the help of my son, the CT or CJRT of the modest initials on the maps. I had to devote many days, the last 3 virtually without food or bed, to drawing, rescaling, and adjusting a large map, at which he then worked for 24 hours, 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. without bed, in redrawing just in time. The first of Tolkien's maps to be published were the ones included in The Hobbit. Of these, Thror's map is especially noteworthy because it actually exists as an item in the story, and plays a critical role in the plot. Made by Thorin's grandfather Thror, it shows the Lonely Mountain and its surroundings, with the crucial addition of a previously unknown secret entrance, plus further invisible instructions, eventually revealed by the light of the midsummer crescent moon. Though it shows some information about places on Bilbo's journey, it's almost more an illustration than a reference document. In fact, Tolkien originally seemed to think it would be included in the text of Chapter 1, just as the other illustrations he provided appear in the course of the text as they become relevant. One of Tolkien's drafts of this map includes the title, Thror's Map, copied by B. Baggins, so we can conclude that the image in the book is not meant to represent Thror's map itself, but rather a copy of it. And of course, given that its title and labels are in English, and its Cirith runes are English transliterations, it would furthermore be a translation of this copy. Later editions of The Hobbit include an introductory note that acknowledged this, but at the time of the first printing, Tolkien had not yet fully adopted the pose of translator from the Westron that he would take in The Lord of the Rings. While superficially similar to Thror's map in style, the map of Wilderland has a greater level of geographic detail and a more modern approach to scale, and its northern orientation and exclusive use of the Roman alphabet make it more immediately useful as a map to its audience. The left margin of the map of Wilderland literally marks the edge of the wild, with a double red line no less, with everything before the ford summed up by 2 arrows labeled Western Lands and Hobbiton. The map extends from Elrond's last homely house to the Lonely Mountain itself. That is, it only goes as far east as Bilbo actually traveled. If we take The Hobbit to be a translation of Bilbo's memoirs of his journey, we can assume the map reflects his perspective, and therefore the omission of everything west of Rivendell is telling. The author of this map assumed everyone would already be familiar with this territory, and so he sees no point in depicting it. Moreover, the scope of the Map of Wilderland perfectly fits the narrator's description of his own narrative. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. The novel opens in Hobbiton, but the unexpected adventure does not begin until Bilbo has passed the edge of the wild. Though the story is called There and Back Again, by the time Bilbo does turn back again, basically all his character growth has already happened, and the real adventure is over. In The Road to Middle-earth, Tom Shippey says that the maps in The Hobbit added nothing to the story but decoration and a here be tigers feel of quaintness. Others are less dismissive, arguing the maps do support the world-building. For example, Ekman and Stentor Danielson both observe that, like many real medieval maps, Thror's map is oriented with east at the top, which Tolkien elsewhere tells us is customary for dwarvish maps. Ekman also mentions that, unlike the maps in The Lord of the Rings, the maps in The Hobbit tell us something about the population of the areas they show. Thror's map specifies spiders in Mirkwood, men in Esgaroth, Dain and his dwarves to the east, and the Elven King, with, one presumes, his elven subjects, to the south. The concentration of different peoples, creatures, and nations in distinct geographic areas is another idea that's been so often emphasized in fantasy that it's become a cliché. Think your standard enchanted elven forests, mountainous dwarven strongholds, and cosmopolitan human ports. So it's interesting to see such information included on these maps, but essentially absent from Tolkien's later ones. Finally, there's the prominence of the runes on Thror's map, which Tolkien promises, in his introductory note, can be deciphered by comparing them to their translation in the text. His designs for the dust jacket and binding of the book also contain runic Easter eggs, and his original design for Thror's map was that the moon runes would be printed in reverse on the backside of the illustration so that they would be faintly visible if the page was held up to the light. This enthusiasm for audience participation was part of what made the book so popular among young readers, but potentially at the expense of fostering real secondary belief. Instead, Thror's map, the runes, and the book itself present themselves as items to be used in an interactive game of make-believe. Just as The Hobbit became the basis of the greatly expanded story of The Lord of the Rings, the Map of Wilderland became the basis for Tolkien's ever-evolving working map of Western Middle-earth. As early as 1938, as he tried to feel his way through the opening chapters of The New Hobbit, Tolkien began to draw the first maps of the Shire itself. By the early 40s, before his drafts of the novel had progressed past LÃ§πρωrien, he had also created the first small-scale map of Middle-earth at a glance. This originally consisted of 2 glued-together sheets of paper, which Tolkien expanded, first to the northwest and then to the south, by gluing on additional overlapping sections. The central portion of the map was most frequently revised, and therefore frequently replaced. Christopher Tolkien reports that, of geographical features, most of what is represented on the visible part of the oldest section goes back to the beginning, and of course a substantial part of that was derived from the Map of Wilderland in The Hobbit. This first map is described as a strange, battered, fascinating, extremely complicated, and highly characteristic document, made with great care and delicacy until a late stage of correction, and it has an exceedingly elvish and archaic air. It is now a difficult document to decipher, reports Christopher Tolkien, not because it was carelessly made, but because it was so frequently used, folded and unfolded, amended and revised, with new or experimental names faintly penciled in and landforms marked in colored chalk that has since faded or rubbed off. Showing that for Tolkien, the map was never an afterthought or a mere aid to keep his plot on course, but as much a part of making Middle-earth real as his writing was, and something he not only used often, but put a lot of energy into. While the Map of Wilderland and the first Lord of the Rings maps portrayed many of the same features, there's a major difference in how these features are identified, a difference that, in Shippey's view, expresses a pivotal change in how Tolkien conceived of his setting. Most of the names in The Hobbit, Shippey notes, are really barely names at all. Instead, they are straightforward descriptors, distinguished with capital letters or at most a simple, self-evident adjective. For characters, this is sometimes spiced up with a bit of bilingual punning. Beorn means bear in Old English. Gandalf is Norse for supernatural stick-wielder. But the place names on the map of Wilderland are almost insultingly obvious. Bilbo lives in Hobbiton, that is, in Hobbit Town, because, well, that's where hobbits would live. His home is located under the hill beside the water. The town by the water is called Bywater. Rivendell is in a dell, with steep sides that make it look like they were riven, or split. The weather on the Misty Mountains is indeed damp, Mirkwood is a wood that is murky, and Lake Town is a town on a lake. A long lake, which is aptly named the Long Lake. This seeming lack of creativity, argues Shippey, reflects a philological truth that Tolkien was well aware of. Most names, especially place names, used to be purely descriptive. However, that is not how names are now perceived. In the modern world, we take them as labels, as things accordingly in a very close one-to-one relationship with whatever they label. And that means they are extraordinarily useful to fantasy, weighing it down, as they do, with repeated implicit assurances of the existence of the things they label, and of course of their nature and history, too. One way a name can be divorced from its original descriptive meaning is through the natural evolution of language over time. We see examples of this in the Shire map, with names mostly drawn from actual English landscapes. Many of them sound like whimsical, nonsensical combinations of English words. Shippey identifies Nobottle, Frogmorton, and Scary as examples. Further east, Bree, Staddle, and Archet have familiar sounds, but don't suggest particular words, reflecting the mingling of dialects spoken by the men of the area and the waves of hobbit migration that settled or passed through it. Shippey observes that Bree Hill and Chetwood are also taken from real life. In Welsh, Bree means hill and Chet means wood, so Bree Hill must have originally meant something like the hill that the weirdos who live there call Bree for some reason. Further on from the Shire, we see landmarks given two names, one Sindarin and another in Westron that is either a translation or reproduces the sounds of the Sindarin one, like the river Lune or the Brandywine, known to the elves as the Baranduin. In the south, Sindarin names predominate, except in Rohan, whose own native tongue is represented in the novel by Anglo-Saxon, giving us names like Isengard and Edoras, clearly akin to but distinct from the Westron, represented by modern English. The making of the maps was instrumental in helping Tolkien create a complex, compelling, and above all credible sub-creative world, in part by replicating the kinds of relationships between different words and languages that he'd studied professionally. The characters' progression through the world the maps portray conveys these relationships almost subconsciously. Thus, the hobbits' expanding historical awareness and their understanding of the interrelations between the safe, sleepy Shire and the broader world is made visible in the maps. Another development that shows up on the maps is an increasing concern with accuracy and realism. Maintaining this sense of reality cost Tolkien quite a bit of time and effort, even though he claimed he had made his story fit his map instead of the other way around. Revising the maps so that the published versions would not only be readable but consistent and accurate was a time-consuming task. In a letter to his publisher, Tolkien laments, "I have not been as careful as I should in keeping track of distances. I think a large-scale map simply reveals all the chinks in the armor, besides being obliged to differ somewhat from the printed small-scale version, which was semi-pictorial." Although the Lord of the Rings maps are known as templates for future maps of fantasy worlds, there is very little that is fantastical in Middle-earth's geography. There's no swirling vortex of dark energy or floating sky islands. Whatever enchantments there are that protect LÃ¶rien are subtle enough that they can't really be perceived, much less mapped. Mount Doom is a fairly ordinary volcano. Its power over the One Ring is not innate, but a product of Sauron's choice to locate his forges there. In another letter to a reader, he acknowledged that the maps provided in the books would not totally answer readers' questions. Many like you demand maps, others wish for geological indications rather than places, noting having geological interests and a very little knowledge, I have not wholly neglected this aspect, but its indication is rather more difficult and perilous. Middle-earth's mountain ranges in particular arouse doubt, meeting at unnaturally square angles. However, even some of these deviations from the naturalistic could indicate intersections of setting and story. Middle-earth's shape is due to successive conflicts between the Valar and Morgoth. The Misty Mountains, for example, are explained in the Silmarillion as a product not of natural tectonic activity, but of Morgoth's desire to hinder Orome. Tolkien would later attribute Mount Doom itself to Morgoth. These changes in how Tolkien portrayed Middle-earth accompany a shift in the relationship between the maps and the book. Students of literature sometimes make a distinction between extra elements that appear within the context of a given piece of writing and things that are attached to it but remain separate from it. By presenting itself as a translation, The Lord of the Rings deliberately blurs this distinction, but all the same, we can say that the appendices and preface are examples of the former, as they both define and enter into the frame of secondary belief that surrounds the novel. The foreword and index are examples of the latter, grounded firmly in primary reality, giving information about the physical book itself rather than about the story told in it. Although printed as end papers, both Hobbit maps are best understood within the context of the story. Thror's map is an actual item within it, and the Wilderland map is clearly tied to Bilbo's perspective. Ekman argues that the map titled Part of the Shire is a borderline case, inserted after the preface and the note on the Shire records, but before the start of Chapter 1. Does this mean we should consider it part of the story, with its own fictional history and authors, like the appendices and indeed the text of the novel itself? While there's no explicit explanation for this, like the one given for Thror's map, we know the hobbits do use and make maps. Even before his adventure, Bilbo already likes maps and prominently displays several in his home. Frodo goes over them as he grows restless in the Shire, and Merry makes a point of studying maps in Rivendell. The Shire map might be emblematic of one of these, particularly since no one else but a hobbit would know such intimate geographic details at this point in history. By contrast, the general map does not exist within the text. It's even outside the framing device, and I mean outside in a very literal sense. In the first edition and in many subsequent hardcover editions, it appears as a fold-out sheet glued into the cover. One of my paperback editions inserts it before the prologue, while the other puts it at the very end, after the index. Readers of The Lord of the Rings, and readers of fantasy in general, report they often look at such maps before they start reading the book. Danielson concludes the map was never conceived as an artifact from within Middle-earth. Instead, it was a method of tracking the facts of the world's geography in order to ensure that the story was plausible. This is a map for readers to use, something to inform and guide their appreciation of the subcreative work, but not itself a part of the subcreation. Several of the map's features reflect this, such as the scale, given in miles, the compass rose showing north at the top of the page, and the exclusive use of the Roman alphabet. Ekman calls its style pseudo-medieval. It bears very little resemblance to actual medieval maps, but it uses a limited number of pre-Enlightenment topographical symbols, ones readers can instantly interpret while still getting the sense of some far distant era. In addition to acknowledging its role in the novel's composition, Tolkien often referenced the importance the map would have to readers. In a letter to Naomi Mitchison, who had proofread The Lord of the Rings without having a copy of the maps, he wrote, "I am sorry about the geography. It must have been dreadfully difficult without a map or maps. In any case, it is weary work to compose a map from a story, as I fear you have found." The maps in The Lord of the Rings, therefore, are not only a reflection of Tolkien's creative process, they also represent one of the ways he shaped his readers' experiences and expectations. The Shire map in The Fellowship of the Ring not only helps to transition readers into the novel, but sets the stage for the plot and themes of the first book. Assuming the reader has already glimpsed the sweeping general map, its contrast with the Shire map immediately creates dissonance, since the reader can already see that the scope of the story is potentially much vaster than is being depicted here at the opening of Book 1. Despite being titled A Part of the Shire, the map in fact depicts both parts of the Shire and parts of what is not the Shire, including Buckland, Crickhollow, and the Old Forest. Ekman finds the lack of distinction here telling in itself, evidence of the Hobbit protagonist's overconfidence. From the map's perspective, everything in the known world might as well be part of the Shire, and therefore, naturally, entirely safe and easily manageable. Of course, these assumptions quickly lead the hobbits into danger, even in the relatively familiar territory they travel through in Book 1. If you want to hear me go on about this particular theme for 20 minutes, I did a whole video just on the Old Forest chapters, which you can check out at your leisure. In Volume 3, the upscaled map of Rohan, Gondor, and Mordor mirrors the effect of the map of part of the Shire, as the war's acceleration forces the hobbits to become as conversant with the geographical details of foreign lands as they once were with their own homes, but for much less pleasant reasons. Tolkien originally wanted to reprint the Shire map in the third volume, alongside the Maps of the South, which would have both emphasized this contrast and foreshadowed the final engagement of the war, a battle for the Shire. In its position at the threshold of the story, the general map illustrates the there and back again structure of The Lord of the Rings, which ironically is different from The Hobbit. While Bilbo's adventure is basically over on the return journey, the aftermath of the Ring Quest, a literal and figurative journey back again, gives the fullest account of the end of the Third Age and the start of the Fourth. The return journey west and north from Mount Doom includes Aragorn and Arwen's marriage, Theoden's burial marking the end of Rohan's second line of kings, Legolas and Gimli finally departing for their respective homes, a farewell to the Ents and to Galadriel, the hobbits taking responsibility for their own home in the Scouring of the Shire, and finally, Frodo's continuation of the westward journey past the borders of the Shire, and his departure from Mithlond for the Undying Lands. Ekman notes that Fangorn and LÃ§πρωrien are located in the very middle of the map. Both already represent minuscule remnants of the lost forests of the ancient world, and by the end of the story it's clear that both realms are doomed to become empty and forgotten. Despite the supposedly triumphant outcome of the quest, Ekman says it is on that loss, on the doom of elves and ents and all things magical, that the map is centered. In addition to enriching the story, the maps also affect how readers imagine the entire world of Middle-earth. Both of the Hobbit maps and the two zoomed-in maps of The Lord of the Rings show a small enough region that the land extends beyond the map's borders on all sides. In fact, most of them contain arrows, indicating what lies beyond those borders, affirming that even the known world is much larger than what the map portrays. By contrast, the general map is largely contained by what map critics call water margins. These are not necessarily literal bodies of water. An impassable mountain range, magical barrier, or desert wasteland beyond which no one can travel can serve the same purpose. The message remains the same. This map shows the full extent of not just the known, but the knowable world. The west and south of Middle-earth are bordered by the sea, with nothing on the other side of it except, for some, the Undying Lands. And to the north there is only the sparsely populated wastes of Forodwaith. To the east and southeast, though, there's more potential, with named land extending beyond the edge of the map. The level of detail decreases the further east you go, suggesting a bleeding edge of ongoing discovery. While very little is known about Rhûn and Khand, or even about southern Gondor, at the end of the Third Age, more will be learned during the Fourth Age, as the fall of Sauron allows for much freer exploration. The map also names a number of places that aren't in the story, emphasizing that even so sprawling a narrative as this one, whose main events have such far-reaching consequences, remains but a selection of what there is to know, a theme Tolkien also consciously cultivated in the text. Finally, there is next to no trace of either the Empire of Númenor or the fabled realms of Beleriand, like Nargothrond and Gondolin. Attentive readers of the appendices, or those later privileged with knowledge of the Silmarillion, know why this is, but in any case the faint traces that do remain are as tantalizing as they are tragic. For a fuller look at these remnants, you can check out one of my earlier videos on the geographic remnants of earlier ages. All of this extra map space is an invitation for readers to contribute to the subcreation, extrapolating from the existing elements of Middle-earth's geography to hypothesize about unknown regions. In an article on fan cartography, which, yes, is apparently a thing, Danielson observes that most maps of Middle-earth, made and shared by Tolkien's readers, illustrate our tendency to treat maps as objective representations of geographical fact rather than texts constructed by particular authors for particular purposes. Karen Wynn Fonstad's Atlas of Middle-earth is a shining example of this. Not only is it a helpful reference, but it gives you an idea of just how many different kinds of maps can be made from a given setting. Danielson says Fonstad's approach rested on the assumption that every detail contained in Tolkien's works, both those in the texts and, crucially, those in the maps, are objective facts, and the task of the cartographer is to compile and reconcile them all. There's nothing wrong with this approach, of course, and Danielson characterizes Fonstad's work as magisterial, but also argues that few people even seem to realize that cartographical elements themselves offer room for creativity. Of course, counterexamples exist, such as the traditional dwarf map made by the author of a blog called The Dwaro Scholar, written in Cirth and showing the traditional dwarven east-up orientation, along with Danielson's own map that shows the west-up elven orientation. However, the article concludes that these are the exceptions that prove the rule. Even though these conventions were described by Tolkien himself, it is rare to see them adopted in fan-made maps. In an article from 1981, at the very dawn of formal Tolkien scholarship, R.C. Walker not only argues that Tolkien-style maps should practically be considered requirements for writing fantasy, but also that this requirement should be made retrospective. We should aim, therefore, at the compilation of new maps for fantasy tales where sufficient detail exists to draw them, and for which good maps are not now available. His zeal is not entirely misplaced. Mapping the secondary world proved to be a vital component of the kind of fantasy Tolkien had hoped to create, in which creating and sustaining a collaborative secondary belief in an invented world was a main goal. But the maps in The Lord of the Rings work so well because they represent in a single glance so many of the specific features of Tolkien's world and story. The linguistic inspiration and invention, the combination of extensive naturalistic detail paired with suggestive glimpses of hidden vistas and untold tales, the structure of the quest narrative itself, the theme of the Hobbit's horizons expanding literally and metaphorically, the elegiac tone, and the bittersweet ending. Ironically, these traits, which are most closely tied to Middle-earth's idiosyncrasies, are likely to be unreflectively replicated in maps of totally different fantasy worlds. Ekman's survey of fantasy maps, though limited, suggests that maps are much more common in high fantasy than in low, and that they most often depict the invented world, on a scale mainly varying between national and global. Similar common trends include the pseudo-medieval aesthetic, a focus on topography, realms flamboyantly labeled with lovingly lettered names splashing across the page, though the boundaries between these realms are less often included, and the so-called left-aligned fantasy map, with north at the top, an ocean to the west, and land extending east and south apparently forever. This, I would argue, is the real problem with the generic fantasy map, not the idea in itself. Maps are almost infinitely flexible in what information they reveal, how they do it, and the implicit ideas they can convey. In a good map, these features are chosen carefully to complement the setting, and the map may take into account the perspectives of characters in the story, the real or fictional mapmakers themselves, and the readers. An uninspired or perfunctory map, on the other hand, simply copies or recreates the style and elements of other worlds without question, invoking the form of map without creatively engaging with it as a medium in its own right. If you enjoyed this video, let your mouse map its way to the like button, and from there consider simply walking into the realm of subscribers by clicking the button to its uttermost west, assuming of course that YouTube employs the north-up orientation. Believe it or not, I did cut quite a few tangents out of this script, including one in which I verbally challenged Tom Shippey to a duel, so if you somehow have not yet had your fill of map talk, there will be more discussion on this topic over on my Patreon, where you can also say hi on Discord, vote on upcoming videos, and find other cool perks. Follow the link in the description to learn more. As always, thank you to everyone for watching, and tremendous thanks to my Patreon supporters who not only suggested this topic, but helped to keep the whole channel going. These include Bruno D, Sam Calder, Seven-Eyed, Rico Mariani, Perheil the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B, James A. McCormick, Gandalf the Grey, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, Joel Bion, and Jared Carver.